Okay, guys, so we've done our first video on Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, and we have reviewed rule number 1, stand up straight with your shoulders back. And now tonight I want to go into rule number 2. Rule number 2 is a very interesting one, okay? And he deals a lot with the Bible itself as he talks about rule number 2. So this is one hopefully that people will find interesting and people will find helpful, okay? Rule number 2 is this: treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping. And I think this is a really interesting topic because of the fact that self-esteem was something that was very popular in the culture probably 10, 20 years ago. And I always heard the church preaching against it. Okay. So people would say, you need more self-esteem. You need to believe in yourself. You need to trust yourself. You need to forgive yourself. You would hear a lot of this language. And a lot of the church language I heard was rhetoric against these ideas. I would hear things like, we don't need any more self-esteem. You already like yourself well enough. And if you think about the golden rule, for example, Jesus says in Matthew 7:12, whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them. And a lot of people I heard preaching said things like, the implication of this is you already love yourself well enough, so you should go about the process of loving others. And of course, there's the idea of original sin and total depravity. The idea being, come on, you're entirely and completely self-absorbed, you're self-centered, you're focused on your own stuff. That's not what you need. You don't need any more of that. What you need is to focus on others rather than on self. So, when I first heard this rule, treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping, it kind of had those overtones of self-esteem to me. And I thought to myself, man, this might be a tough one to engage with biblically, okay? Now, one thing I want to throw out here, Jordan Peterson in chapter 1 talked about original sin, okay? And I mentioned the fact that I love that he brought up original sin, that he brought up total depravity, and he dropped that in chapter 1. So there's got to be some way, at least in Peterson's mind, that original sin or total depravity doesn't conflict with the idea of treating yourself well and treating yourself like someone you're responsible for helping, okay? So with that said, let's go ahead and jump right in and begin talking about this idea. So here you can see the rule itself. Again, treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping. And what he's talking about here, he brings up in this quote. I thought this was interesting. Essentially, this is the idea. He says, people are better at filling and properly administering prescription medication to their pets than to themselves. So you go to the doctor says, here's your prescription, go to the pharmacy, get your prescription, take it twice daily, etc. And he says people do a really bad job of that in general, if you look at the statistics. But if your pet is sick, so often people will go out of their way to go to the vet, get the prescription medication for their pet, and they will diligently administer it every single day. And statistics prove that people are better about caring for their pets than they are about caring for themselves. And this is the question that got Peterson going on this topic. Why is this? Why aren't people caring for themselves like they do for their pets? Okay? And that's what he begins to explore in this chapter. So I thought this was a really interesting idea. Okay? Now, one of the first things he goes into is this idea of pain. Okay? This idea of pain is very important to him. He says this: everyone acts as if their pain is real, ultimately, finally real. Pain matters more than matter matters. Okay? Pain is a huge issue for him, and he says this is one of the driving and motivating factors for humanity in general. I thought that was very interesting, okay? So the first question I want to ask ourselves is, does pain occupy such an essential and focused position in our lives? Here, the concept of pain and being so central. He says this is evolutionarily established, that this is something that we just are and we have to focus on. And it's basically an ultimate reality. It matters more than matter does, is what he essentially says. Can this be squared biblically? Well, I think it can, all right? There's a few passages where our pain is talked about as something that we are desiring to escape, and we should seek to escape our pain through Christ, okay? Jesus said this in Matthew 11:28, come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. This is really a call to escape the pain of the existence that you're living in now. You are heavy laden. You labor, okay? You feel weary. You feel weighed down. And Jesus says, I will give you rest for your souls. Verse 29, take my yoke upon you, learn from me. I am gentle and lowly in heart. You will find rest for your souls. My yoke is easy. My burden is light. Very important passage. And here, I think this is akin to pain. I think this is related to the idea of pain. It's not a deadlock, but the Bible isn't trying to talk about our pain in the same way that Peterson is in his book. Peterson is talking about that physical drive, that physical urge, whereas the Bible itself is more concerned with our existential position in the universe, with the fact that we struggle with our existence, and the Bible wants to help us. It wants to give us rest, okay? The other passage that I thought of when it comes to this idea is Isaiah 55:1. Come, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters. He who has no money, come buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money, without price. Why do you spend your money for that which is not bread, and your labor for that which does not satisfy? Listen diligently to me and eat what is good. Delight yourselves in rich food. So here's the idea is, look, you're struggling and you're wasting your money on things that don't matter. Come buy wine and milk without money and price. Okay. And again, I think this is associated with some of the pain ideas. There's another biblical topic that's talked about constantly. That's the idea of shalom, right? Shalom is peace. That's a simplistic translation. It's not just the lack of war, but it is perfect harmony, perfection in everything that it entails. And in this sense, I do think a perfect shalom would lack pain. Okay, there's this aching that we all have, this aching that we all recognize, and I think a lack of those things can also be a lack of pain. So, it's not a deadlock because the Bible isn't trying to talk about it in the same sense that we often are, but I give Peterson a B+ on this one because I think that his identification of pain as a primary thing that the human condition is concerned with has enough supporting evidence from other scriptures that it is pretty biblical. So B+ from me on this one. The next big topic that he begins to bring up is the idea of chaos and order. This is a major theme in Jordan Peterson's thinking, okay? In fact, his book series is a 2-part book series, okay? The first one, 12 Rules for Life, is about establishing order amidst chaos. The second one, Beyond Order, is about the balancing aspect of it with chaos instead of order. So the order-chaos dynamic is extremely important to Peterson, and it's something that he deals with extensively in all of his work. He talks about it explicitly here in this chapter. So first he says this: the scientific world of matter can be reduced in some sense to its fundamental constituent elements, molecules, atoms, even quarks. However, the world of experience has primal constituents as well. These are the necessary elements whose interactions define drama and fiction. One of these is chaos, another is order. So I want to explain to you what he's talking about here. What he's saying is when we look at the world from a material lens, when we're doing science, we can boil things down to molecules, atoms, etc. Those are the things of which the material world is made up, okay? Now let's transition to a different world, if you will. In the world of experience, as he calls it, and I would like to add the world of story, the spiritual world, the spiritual realm, okay? In this world, we can also boil things down to its primary elements. And for him, these are chaos and order, okay? Chaos and order are the two elements of which the story realm, the spiritual realm is made up. And then he says there's a third thing that mediates in between the two, and he calls this one consciousness. The third, as there are three, is the process that mediates between the two, which appears identical to what modern people call consciousness. Okay? So in the spiritual world, we have order and chaos, and the mediating realm between those two is consciousness. And he goes into this topic directly and starts to explain a lot of his ideas surrounding it. Chaos is where we are when we don't know where we are, and what we are doing when we don't know what we are doing. It is, in short, all those things and situations we neither know or understand. This is what it means to be in chaos, okay? By contrast, order is explored territory. That's the hundreds of millions of years old hierarchy of place, position, and authority. That's the structure of society, Okay? So chaos is this realm where you don't know what's going on, you don't understand, you can't figure it out, and order is explored territory. This is where you do have things figured out. This is where you do understand. So is this idea of chaos and order a biblical one? Okay? Is this idea of chaos and order a biblical one? Well, I think you can make a case for that, actually, initially in Genesis chapter 1. Listen to this. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was, listen to this phrase, without form and void. Okay? In the Hebrew, tohu wabohu. I've heard Robert Alberter translate this as the earth was welter and waste. That's how he puts it. Okay? Without form and void. To me, this is a really good corollary for chaos. All right? So here we have a chaotic space before God spoke into existence creation. He begins to create order out of chaos, right? And darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. So you have this really extreme idea going on right in the beginning of God creating order out of chaos. So I actually think this is a biblical concept, a biblical idea, okay? Now, I think if I understand and follow the narrative arc of the Bible itself correctly, God essentially in Genesis 1 and 2 creates order across the board, and then in Genesis chapter 3, the fall happens and order begins to be reduced and diminished, okay? Order begins to fall apart. Of course, we know in Genesis chapter 3, here is the fall, and then the Lord God begins to curse the serpent, the woman, the man, and the earth associated with it. Listen, the Lord God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and all of the beasts of the field. On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all of the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, you shall bruise his heel." Of course, that's a reference to the gospel and Jesus. To the woman he said, "I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you." And to Adam he said, "Because you've listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you." Cursed is the ground, okay, that's the earth, that's the created order. "In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you. You shall eat of the plant of the field by the sweat of your brow. You shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return." So here you go. God creates order out of chaos, tohu wabohu, Genesis 1-2. Then the order is set up. Man is supposed to tend to the garden and to essentially be vice regents with God over the earth. And then they fall into sin, and God curses the animals, the livestock, the earth itself, and of course the man and the woman. Chaos is reinstated, reestablished. And I think this is also what Paul is talking about in Romans 8:18-23. When he's pointing out the fact that earth is falling apart. He says this, "I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God." The creation is waiting eagerly. It wants the sons of God to be revealed. "For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies." So I think biblically here, we have a very good case to be made that order and chaos are fundamental elements of the spiritual world, the spiritual universe, what God is doing in creation. So on this topic, I've got to give Peterson an A. I think he's nailed it, that there is an order and chaos element to the world. And of course, we as Christians believe that that is God creating order out of chaos. The fall happens, and now it is the responsibility of Jesus to come and reestablish order amidst a chaotic and fallen world. He begins that process with his incarnation, death, burial, and resurrection. And now during the church age, he has continued to work that process until in the final analysis, the new heavens and new earth come, and it is all established. That's kind of the narrative arc of the Bible. So I give Peterson an A on this particular topic, the idea of order and chaos. So we're doing well so far. All right, now let's step into a little more controversial interpretation. Now, this is continuing with the idea of chaos and order, but now he begins to relate chaos and order through the duality of the masculine and the feminine. He says this: order and chaos are not understood first objectively as things or objects and then personified. That would only be the case if we perceived objective reality first and then inferred intent and purpose. Remember, chaos and order live in the story realm. They live in the spiritual world, right? But that isn't how perception operates despite our preconceptions. Perceptions of things as tools, for example, occurs before or in concert with perception of things as objects. We see what things mean just as fast or faster than we see what they are. He continues, this means that male and female and parent and child are categories for us, natural categories deeply embedded in our perceptual, emotional, and motivational structures. Okay, here's his point. These ideas of the masculine, the feminine, the male, the female are such an ingrained, inherent part of us that they almost go beyond these scientific categories that we try to assign to them. And of course, because they are so fundamental to us as human beings, for him, they're going to reflect order and chaos. Order, the known, appears symbolically associated with masculinity. This is perhaps because the primary hierarchical structure of human society is masculine, as it is among most animals. Order is God the Father, the eternal judge, ledger keeper, and dispenser of rewards and punishments. Order is the peacetime army of the policemen and soldiers. It's the political culture, the corporate environment. It's the system. It's the they in you know what they say. It's credit cards, classrooms, supermarket checkout lineups, turn taking, traffic lights, the familiar routes of daily commuters. Order, when pushed too far, when imbalanced, can also manifest itself destructively and terribly. It does so as the forced migration, the concentration camp, the soul-devouring uniformity of the goose step. Okay, and obviously he's he throws some jokes in here and there with his writing. So this is what order is according to him, but the foundational structure through which we recognize this is through masculinity, okay? And then, of course, he's going to go into chaos, and that is reflective of femininity. Now, I want you to know he took a little bit of heat for this distinction in some of his interviews. People were talking to him and being like, why are women chaos? Jordan, why won't you answer that for us? Now, the first distinction we need to recognize is he's not saying men and women, he's saying masculine and feminine. I don't know if you've ever heard of divine masculine and divine feminine, but those categories are much closer to what he is utilizing to describe these than is man or woman, male or female, okay? That's something that needs to be understood. But I will say it's at this point with this one that I'm struggling a bit. Because biblically speaking, we don't see a lot of distinguishing order chaos in the masculine and feminine described. This one is a big struggle for me, guys. It's hard for me to relate this idea from a biblical perspective. You know what? I'm doing this on the fly, but I want to bring up a video I watched where somebody who was considering Christianity actually struggled with the idea of Christianity because it didn't seem to have a divine feminine in it. Now, this is Paul Vanderklay. You guys know I'm a huge fan of Paul Vanderklay, and he has been doing these discussions with Rafe Kelly. Now, Rafe Kelly is not a Christian, but he describes himself as a Christian atheist. He's trying to figure out Christianity. He thinks Christianity has a lot to offer the world, but he's unable to reconcile this idea of a personal creator God. That's what he's struggling with. And one of his big knocks against Christianity, he brings up in this conversation, is this idea of the divine feminine. Okay, this is one of his big knocks against Christianity. And so I want to go ahead and play this question that he asks, and I'm going to play it through, and then I'm going to give my thoughts because I think it's very relevant to our discussion at this point. I'm going to give you guys ahead of time, I'm just going to kind of let you know how I'm falling on this topic, on this specific topic, this specific point. I give Peterson a C on the masculine and feminine being representative of order and chaos. And that might be more due to me than anything, but I have a serious struggle to find the divine feminine or femininity as chaos and masculinity as order in the Bible. I see the order chaos elements, and we already looked at that, tohu wabohu, etc. But I really struggle to find this divine feminine, divine masculine themes. I don't see them there. And that's a struggle for me. And so I want you to know Rafe recognizes this, but he is using it as a knock against Christianity because he likes Jordan Peterson's program. He believes a lot of that, and he sees value in the divine feminine. And so he asks Vanderklay, where's the divine feminine? Okay? If Christianity fully explains or gives the best explanation of the way things are, why is there no divine feminine? Okay, so let's go ahead and watch this conversation between the two. I always watch on 2x speed. Let me slow this down to normal. Let's see what they have to say, and then I'll stop it after their discussion and make some further comments on this one.
Something that I've struggled with and I wanted to put to you, which is the role of the divine feminine, right? And, in Peterson's Maps of Meaning, he talks about this idea that there is father culture and mother nature and the divine individual. And each of these has a beneficent and a vindictive or a tyrannical aspect, right? Mother nature is the spring, right? And it's the harvest, and it's also the flood. And the king is the thing that gives us culture, right? That gives us fire, that gives us all these things. And it's also the thing that prevents us from freedom, right? And the individual is the hero, and the individual is the adversary that aims itself against B. So he makes this claim, and then he makes the claim that Christianity is the most archetypally complete religion. And yet it seems that the divine feminine is not fully represented in Christianity to me, right? Because we have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And, I was looking at this morning. I believe that, some scholars of Semitic religion believe that Yahweh used to have a consort named Asherah, and yet she's not there anymore. And Tiamat, who is the mother goddess of the Mesopotamians, her name is retained in the Bible as it's the root of the word for flood in the Hebrew, I believe. And yet the flood is not personified as an individual. It's only there as a natural element. And
I'm terribly secular of the Bible.
Yeah. And I have this sense, when I contrast those two aspects of Peterson's message, I have this question that comes up. There's two aspects to it. Looking at both the beneficent or the beneficial and the negative. So one aspect is, up until maybe 150 years ago, Mother Nature was always more powerful than father culture. We were always scraping ourself by against the exigencies of nature, right? But for the first time in human history, we have the technological power to destroy the capacity of the earth to be beneficent. So how can a religion that doesn't describe the divine feminine answer our needs in being able to articulate and have a story that guides us in relationship to it. So that's the beneficent side. And the negative side is this. For most of agrarian history, women were limited in their social power because of the nature of men having to do plowing and men being predominant in war. But we exist in a situation now where women have far more power, really, than they've had. They have far more opportunity to climb the top of the hierarchies that determine where the nuclear bombs go and if they go. But it seems to me that if you don't have a model for how the feminine becomes weaponized and destructive and the flood, then you're not equipped to answer the questions that we're facing. So how does a religion that doesn't have that deal with this? I had a conversation with Chloe Valdry, but I love the movie Moana because I feel like it's the hero's journey that Peterson describes, with a lot of these memes focused on the divine feminine, right? The feminine hero, and she sees the destructive aspect of Mother Nature and takes something from the cultural aspect that's been stolen and gives it back to her and returns her to the beneficent aspect of herself, right? So that's my line of reasoning, and that's a hesitation for me about saying, okay, I'm going to commit myself to Christianity. It's like, well, and we have Mary, right? And Mary has she's risen to the level of divinity in the consciousness of many people, and that's something that I think there's quite a lot of controversy with in Christian circles. So I'm curious to have you speak to that.
Okay, so there you go. And Rafe is expressing the very same misgivings that I have when it comes to this idea of the divine feminine and divine masculine. Marin says, I'm still struggling with understanding this topic. Is the divine feminine represented in the Orthodox Catholic prayers to Mary? I think here's the point, okay? Rafe is coming at Christianity. He kind of wants to embrace Christianity, but he's still in the process of figuring things out, and he's coming to it through these Peterson ideas, the story realm, etc., and he likes the idea of order and chaos, and I've already demonstrated I think that that's a biblical idea. But Peterson goes a step further. He relates order and chaos to the divine masculine and the divine feminine in mythological ways. And Rafe is like, oh, I see that balance. I see that, that tension in creation. So here's his question. If Christianity is the best religion to account for these archetypal differences we see in mythology, why is the divine feminine not represented well in the Bible? And that's my struggle as well. I read it, I see his emphasis on the divine feminine, and I go, ugh. But I'm already a Christian. I'm just wondering if we're imposing something on the text, whereas Rafe is saying, I wish it was talked about more. I wish it was explicated more. So Marin, his point is, I don't find the divine feminine in the Bible. It doesn't look to me like it exists in the Bible. What gives? And I kind of agree with him. Now, what you brought up, Marin, is interesting, and he brought it up right there at the end. It's almost as though the ascension of Mary to her status is some people's implicit way of trying to account for a lack of the divine feminine in the biblical narrative. So it's almost as though some people subconsciously recognized this lack of the divine feminine in Christianity, and they tried to place Mary in that position in order to fill in a gap in the Bible. Now, obviously, as a Bible-believing Christian, I don't believe there's a gap there. I don't believe there's an issue with that. But I see their point, right? Their point is essentially, where's the divine feminine at? If order and chaos is such an important idea, and that can be tied to masculinity and femininity, where is it at? Because I see Father, I see Son, I see Holy Spirit, I see all of these represented in his terms. That's the contention.
I'm quite persuaded by Peugeot pointing out that a lot of what we've done in our culture in the so-called empowerment of women is basically invited them into the masculine.
Yeah.
And in movie representations, essentially the feminine has been banished and the masculine is all that is left, and women are cast in masculine roles. I just last couple of days have been doing some reading about Elizabeth I in England, and people who love to talk about glass ceilings, I don't know if they know anything about Elizabeth I's reign and what she actually did and how she used femininity to, in many ways, change the path of England from a role player in Europe, setting her up to, in many ways, rule the world. Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, how she managed religion, how she managed her sexuality in order to, it's an astoundingly remarkable story that, with all of the attention being paid to powerful women, I seldom hear people talk about Elizabeth I. It's an unbelievable story. Protestantism, I think, struggles in some ways with this because of its reaction for certain theological things to some of what had been tradition in the Orthodox and Roman Catholic world surrounding Mary and the feminine, because there was representation of the feminine in Mary that Protestants tended to dismiss. So I'll do my best to answer the question still as a Protestant, because I think there are a lot of Orthodox and Roman Catholics who can talk more about the feminine than I can, because they have a few resources that I don't have, at least from their tradition. I think in a Protestant way, we are the feminine. The church is the feminine. Humanity is the feminine. And I think that comes through in a whole lot of ways in the Hebrew scriptures and in the prophets. Israel is the bride, is the daughter, is the unfaithful wife of the Lord. That's part of the reason I think the Lord has no bride, because his bride is Israel. And some of the prophets lay that out fairly directly. But she's an unfaithful bride. But that is the role that she is casted. Now, it's very fluid because Israel is also his son. And so, Jesus comes in. So others have noted that in some of Jesus' most, for example, the parable of the prodigal son, the father doesn't have a wife, but the father in some cases acts like a mother. And so mother and father are integrated into the one father character in Luke 15 in the story of the prodigal son, because the father does some very unfatherly things. And that's often caused a lot of speculation. But I think finally, the world and the church are the feminine in Christianity. And when Peugeot was trying to explain the Virgin Mary to Jordan Peterson, I found a lot of what Jonathan said there quite compelling, in that our femininity is our responsiveness to the will of God in how we serve God in the world. And so there's, in some ways, even in the crucifixion of Christ, something deeply feminine about Christ crucified, if we have a certain understanding of masculinity and femininity. And this gets played all the way out to the book of Revelation, where, and this is something that even Protestants can embrace, where the church is the bride of Christ. The Apostle Paul riffs on this in Ephesians 5. And I know this is quite controversial within certain argument circles revolving around things like women's ordination in the Protestant church. But I think in many ways, the church is the divine feminine, because that is the role the church must play. But analogous to Israel in some ways, the church is also the rebellious, adulterous wife, because the church keeps trying to sleep with the other gods. And the church finds again and again that the other gods mistreat her. And what she must do is return to her one true husband. And again, the characters in the story are so fluid. That's very common in Christianity, because Christ in some ways is an image of the divine feminine in one aspect. And in another way, and Paul sort of plays through this in Ephesians 5, Christ is also the husband who gives himself up for the wife, and gives himself up completely for the wife. And that's sort of this dance of masculine and feminine in Christianity, that, it's the husband bears the weight in order to exalt the wife. The beatific vision in Dante is the beatific vision of a woman. It's Beatrice that they are fixated upon. You see this in chivalric traditions. You can read about this in Don Quixote. It's all of this back and forth and back and forth. And masculine and feminine is not destroyed. It is somehow fulfilled. And the fulfilling of it becomes this dance, this divine dance. C.S. Lewis writes about that. Now, in Christian tradition, this divine dance isn't usually sexualized as such, but it's this constant giving and serving for the welfare of the other. And you see that in Peugeot's ideas about, the job of the leader is to give, to sacrifice on behalf of those below. And the job of those below are to give and sacrifice on behalf of those above. And in this, in each fulfilling their roles, what you have is shalom. And you see this so sometimes we see this between father and son. Jesus talks about that in the Gospel of John. C.S. Lewis has some very interesting things to say about equality and the specific pleasure of the inferior. I was in an airport, and I was watching some law enforcement individuals train their dogs in an airport. And the specific joy and glory of those dogs was to play the game, sniffing for, drugs or bombs or what have you. But the dog was simply glorified in its pleasure of serving its master. And that, I would say, is in the Christian dance, that is the joy of the feminine church. That is fulfilled. Yes, fulfilled in serving its master. That's the specific pleasure of the son in serving his father.
But I just have to say,
what's
as
that?
somebody raised in the counterculture.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and stop there. Now, this issue that Rafe is having with the Christianity not having a clear divine feminine is the same issue I'm having, just from the opposite side, right? And so it's interesting. Vanderklay is trying to play the role of a mediator in between. He sees Rafe's hang up, and he wants to try and help him to see that even though Christianity doesn't have a divine feminine, the church does play a feminine type of role, and that is scriptural, right? Christ and his church. His church is described as his bride. Okay, that's interesting. So I see where he's trying to go with that. But it sure does seem like a stretch to try and put these things in. And you could see Vanderklay struggled. You could see he struggled with it. I thought he did an admirable job trying to navigate a Christian biblical worldview while trying to point out, okay, here's where these ideas might exist in the Christian church, right? Here's where they might be. But the fact of the matter is, there is a deficiency in the Bible in terms of not presenting these. Let me clarify my language. The Bible isn't deficient. What I mean is, these ideas aren't there, at least as explicitly as people want them to be. And if those ideas aren't there, we ought not to read into the text ideas that we want to be there. Okay? So, on order being masculine and chaos being feminine, I give Jordan Peterson a C. And it's because I think we're trying to fit too much into these categories. Let me read a little bit more what Peterson has to say. And again, we pointed out several of the other ideas. Okay, these are very in line with biblical concepts, right? Order and chaos themselves are biblical. Tohu wabohu, Genesis 1, we looked at all of that. Very, very clear. But them representing masculinity and femininity, and there being a divine masculine and a divine feminine, these are issues that give me pause as an evangelical Baptist coming to these ideas, and I'm just like, yeah, I'm not seeing it biblically, right? We already looked at order. Let's look at how Peterson describes chaos. He says, chaos, the unknown, is symbolically associated with the feminine. This is partly because all the things we have come to know were born originally of the unknown, just as all beings we encounter were born of mothers. In its positive guise, chaos is possibility itself, the source of ideas, the mysterious realm of gestation and birth. As a negative force, it's the impenetrable darkness of a cave, the accident by the side of the road. It's the mother grizzly, all compassion to her cubs, who marks you out as a potential predator and tears you to pieces. Chaos, the eternal feminine, is also the crushing force of sexual selection. And he goes here into talking about the idea of the fact that in evolutionary biology theory, feminine figures do all of the sexual selecting. Okay? So this is a spot where on this rule for life, I can't go there. I see pain as a B+. I see chaos and order as an A, very biblical idea. But order and chaos being represented with the divine masculine and the divine feminine, I give a C. I just can't see it. It's a real struggle for me to get there. Now, I do like Vanderklay's pointing out that the church is meant to play a feminine type role in its relationship with Christ. I mean, that's thoroughly biblical, right? Even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its savior. So there is a biblical relationship between Christ and his church, and we are described as the bride of Christ. So that's there. But trying to fit it into these ideas of, divine masculine and feminine is just it's a struggle for me, and I'm not seeing it, and that's why I got to give him a C on this one. Now, I recognize that this is an area I can do more work in, but it's something that I have the same hang up as Rafe, but I just have it as a Christian. The next idea, guys, here's his interpretation of Genesis chapter 3. Let's jump into it, guys. Now he is actually going to do some biblical exegesis for us, okay? Here he goes. So, the Garden of Eden, look at this. He's talking about all of this. Now, first of all, he embraces the JEDP theory, okay? If you guys don't know, JEDP essentially says that the book of Genesis is put together by 4 separate scholars, and they kind of stitched it all together, And Genesis 1 is different from Genesis 2. I do not follow that line of interpretation. So already I'm a bit hesitant, right? So he's got the priestly story, the redactor, all of these ideas, okay? So I don't agree with that interpretation. Let's continue. Now, he's talking about the knowledge of good and evil. God placed Adam in there along with all manner of fruit-bearing trees, 2 of which were marked out. One of these was the tree of life, the other the tree of knowledge of good and evil. God then told Adam to have his fill of fruit, all he wished, but added that the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil was forbidden. After that, he created Eve as a partner for Adam. Yeah, agree with all of that, right? Very good. So we continue on. Now, here's something that's interesting. Adam and Eve don't seem very conscious at the beginning, when they are first placed in paradise, and they were certainly not self-conscious. As the story insists, the original parents were naked but not ashamed. Such phrasing implies, first, that it's perfectly natural for normal people to be ashamed of their nakedness. Agreed. A lot of people today want to say, nakedness shouldn't be shameful, blah, 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 blah. Disagree, and I agree with Peterson's interpretation here. Yep. Otherwise, nothing would have been said about its absence. And second, that there was something amiss, or far better, worse, with our first parents. I think he's implying that there was something wrong with them because they weren't conscious, i.e. hadn't eaten of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I don't know that I'm willing to go there. Although there are exceptions, the only people around now who would be unashamed if suddenly dropped naked into a public place, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, so I agree with that. Now, here you go. He goes to the fall in Genesis chapter 3. In the 3rd chapter of Genesis, a serpent appears, first apparently in a legged form, because he's cursed to go on his belly afterwards. God only knows why he allowed or placed such a creature in the garden. I have long puzzled over the meaning of this. And this is something that is discussed extensively in Christian interpretations and traditions. Okay, so yeah, him puzzling over that, he's not the first. Lots of people have puzzled, why was the serpent allowed in there? It seems to be a reflection in part of the order-chaos dichotomy characterizing all of experience, with paradise serving as habitable order and the serpent playing the role of chaos. So you can see, again, this order and chaos dynamic, he feeds into that. And I just see the order and chaos more in the tohu wabohu and post-fall interpretations, okay? Now, he continues. Now, like statements like this, right? These give us pause as evangelicals. It just does not appear possible, even for God himself, to make a bounded space completely protected from the outside. Okay, like, again, no, God can do anything, right? So, you know, these are things that give you pause, give you hesitation, okay? Now, he continues on, and here's where I want to get into some of the ideas, okay? We have seen the enemy, after all, he is us. Wait a second, let's go back to the beginning. Even if we had defeated all the snakes that beset us from without, reptilian and humankind, we would still not have been safe. Nor are we now. We have seen the enemy, after all, he is us. The snake inhabits each of our souls. This is the reason, as far as I can tell, for the strange Christian insistence, made most explicit by John Milton, that the snake in the Garden of Eden was also Satan, the spirit of evil itself. The importance of this symbolic identification, its staggering brilliance, can hardly be overstated. This is getting into the idea of original sin again, guys. And we already talked about original sin from chapter 1. He mentioned it in chapter 1 explicitly. We gave Peterson an A on original sin. And this is true. How often have people blamed all of their problems on the devil? How often have they blamed all of their problems on Satan? And the fact of the matter is, we, because of original sin and total depravity, create our own problems as well. Okay? Very important idea. Okay, so he's right on that one. Work beyond comprehension was invested into the idea of good and evil and its surrounding dreamlike metaphor. The worst of all possible snakes is the eternal human proclivity for evil. Look at that. Super explicit. And he's 100% right. That's original sin, that's total depravity, and it comes from this fall. The worst of all possible snakes is psychological, spiritual, personal, internal. No walls, however tall, will keep that out. And he quotes Solzhenitsyn. I mean, again, that's one we've already given an A. I got it right here. Original sin, A, already discussed. That's fantastic. And he's right. He's dead on. And this is something that people in our society and culture don't want to embrace. They don't want to embrace original sin. They don't want to embrace the idea that human beings are evil, that we are totally depraved. Okay? So, very interesting. And then, of course, he gets into, it is far better to render beings in your care competent than to protect them. So, where do I place his interpretation of Genesis 3? Well, he gets pretty mythological with it, right? It kind of reminds me of some of the interpretations of the early church fathers. And again, I come out of this perspective of an evangelical Protestant Baptist tradition. And our perspective is to read this as historical narrative. This is what happened. And you can see with some of his language, dreamlike state. It's almost implying an allegory, right? So when you start to examine it from that perspective, you begin to struggle with these ideas a little bit more. Now, again, I want you to know that this is because I'm Protestant that I'm struggling with this. I actually have a book on an interpretation of the book of Genesis written by an Eastern Orthodox, and I want you to see it, okay? The Language of Creation, Cosmic Symbolism in Genesis, a commentary, Matthew Pajot. And the interpretation of Genesis from this Eastern Orthodox pastor is much more in line with Jordan Peterson's ideas, right? It's more mythology, again, symbolic, right? These types of interpretations are very popular. And Peterson lines himself a little bit more with that interpretation. And Eastern Orthodox and even some Roman Catholics, and probably even some Protestants as well, are happy to interpret it in this way. I was heard it described to me in this form. Somebody told me that all we do in churches, i.e. Protestant churches, is teach people what the text says. Instead, we need to move a step further and teach them what it means. The implication being that what we do as Protestants, going, it's historical narrative, this really happened, this is where it comes from, etc., all of those ideas are only telling people what the text says. In reality, what the text means is this symbolism, this metaphor, this mythological sort of way of interpreting. And again, guys, I struggle with that. I struggle with that as a Protestant. I struggle with that as a Baptist. I struggle with that trained in an evangelical tradition, because we interpret the Bible we are not comfortable with these mythological, allegorical, etc. interpretations, okay? Now, where the Bible seems to promote symbolism, I'm cool with that. But it doesn't seem to me that Genesis is one of those books. So I'm going to give this one a C. Now, I am open to the idea that the story is deeper than just on the surface, here's what happened. I'm open to that idea. Oftentimes, truths are truths in the material world, in reality, and truths in the spiritual realm as well, teaching us an ideology also. So that is the case. I need to probably think about this one a little bit more as well, just like this whole order, chaos, masculine, feminine idea. But where he's at with his interpretation of Genesis, I'm going to give it a C, again, just because the evangelical tradition struggles with these concepts. I want to go on to the last idea in the book, and this is this. And I know we've been talking for a while. I want to remind everyone what we were talking about at the beginning. The title of this chapter, the rule that he establishes, is treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping. That is the rule that he's establishing. Treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping. Okay, but this sounds a lot like self-help. And I said at the beginning that we don't like the concept of self-help because Jesus said to love your neighbor as yourself, and we're pretty selfish individuals. We're pretty selfish human beings. We love ourselves plenty. The problem is we don't love others enough. That's a common Christian response. But Peterson doesn't see these things in conflict. He's talked, after all, extensively about the fact that we as human beings are flawed and have original sin. So how does he balance this? How does he, on the one hand, say we're incredibly selfish human beings, we have a serpent dwelling within us, and that's the biggest problem for humanity? How does he say that and also say, now treat yourself like somebody you're responsible for helping? How does he put those ideas together? Because in Christian circles, I often hear it described as one or the other. And this is something I think Peterson does very, very well in this chapter. Here in this chapter, look at where he goes. He goes into this concept of being made in the image of God. Right here, he calls it a spark of the divine. And this is, I think, the balance that we need to bring together, okay? He says this: in the original state of nature, conceived in this manner, is paradisal, but we are no longer one with God and nature. There is simply no turning back, okay? We're created in God's image. He talks about this extensively here, and we remember being made in the image of God, but We have fallen. The original man and woman, existing in an unbroken unity with their creator, did not appear conscious and certainly not self-conscious. Their eyes were not open. But in their perfection, they were also less, not more, than their post-fall counterparts. Again, not really. I'm not really sure I 100% understand what he's saying with that, but we'll continue. Their goodness was something bestowed rather than deserved or earned. They exercised no choice. God knows that's easier, but maybe it's not better than, for example, goodness genuinely earned. Okay? But here's what he's getting at. We're created in the image of God, right? We're created in the image of God, and here, being made in the image of God, we recognize that the spark of the divine within us helps us to offset this very negative view we have of humanity. Okay? Listen to this. The entire Bible is structured so that everything after the fall, the history of Israel, the prophets, the coming of Christ, is presented as a remedy for that fall. I agree with that. Agree with that 100%. This is an amazing thing. The answer is already implicit in Genesis 1. To embody the image of God, to speak out of the chaos, that is good, but to do so consciously on our own free choice, back is the way forward. We need to lean into the image of God, the fact that we were created in God's image. And it seems to me that this is the balance that we as Christians often forget to recognize. We need to hold to a tension here. I talk about tension a lot in my videos. We need to hold to a tension, a biblical tension we must embrace. So in this sense, treating yourself as someone you are responsible for helping is not shallow self-esteem, but instead a deeper concept that I would like to call self-worth. You have value precisely because you are made in the image of God. When you're made in the image of God, you have value, and it is the tension between being made in the image of God and being fallen with a serpent dwelling within us that allows us to act in the fully human manner that we want to act in. So it's not original sin versus self-esteem. It is instead original sin combined with self-worth, being made in the image of God. Embrace this biblical tension, and you can get the ideas correct. This is so important for us, guys. Why? Because in our day and age today, self-esteem may be a shallow thing that we want to oppose, but self-worth is a very important biblical concept that we need to elevate. In our postmodern culture, where nihilism reigns supreme and people genuinely don't think of themselves as anything better than animals, we need to tell people you are made in the image of God. We don't have to turn to nihilism. We don't have to be depressed about our very existence, wondering why we're here and what the point is and what our purpose is. Instead, we derive our purpose, our point from God, and that is because we are made in his image. That's a powerful message that I think Peterson actually gets the balance of right here. He talks about original sin, but he also talks about being made in the image of God, and that we need to return to that idea. He gets the tension right, and the Bible gets this exact tension. The Bible tells us both of these ideas super clearly. And so we need to lean back into this. How does this work in practice? When you're dealing with an individual, try to discern. Are they leaning too much into the image of God, i.e. they think they can conquer the world? Then they need to be told about original sin. Are they leaning too much into the idea of original sin, i.e. they think they're a horrible piece of junk? They need to be told about being made in the image of God. This is a balance that people often need to have. These are two biblical truths that support and help one another. The tension is something that we ought to promote, and I think Peterson gets this one right, and it's consistently in line with the Bible. So this balance of the imago Dei and original sin is something that I give Peterson an A+ on. Honestly, I give him an A+ on this one because he gets this biblical balance perfectly right that we want to emphasize from the Bible as well. And I think I've seen too often in biblical circles the pendulum swung in one direction or the other, an overemphasis on original sin or an overemphasis on the image of God. And both of them result in dysfunction. Instead, hold these two in tension, and those ideas will be entirely brought together. And this is where I come to my final grade. If we consider the arc of the entire chapter as a whole, where he starts, where he goes, where he ends, and his focus on getting this balance, this tension right between original sin and the image of God, I've got to give him an A minus, okay? I've got to give him an A minus. Again, some of the key ideas that fed into this A minus: pain, and the fact that coming to God resolves that pain and that tension, B plus. Chaos and order, A. Original sin, A, already discussed. Balancing the imago Dei with original sin, A plus. Rendering beings in your care competent versus protecting them, A. But a couple of big sticking points here, guys. Order as the divine masculine, chaos as the divine feminine, C minus. And the interpretation of Genesis 3, heavily leaning into allegory and mythology, C. Okay? So with those two caveats, I would just tell somebody to dig a little bit more into interpretation of Genesis, right? There's a lot of material on that. So I would encourage somebody to dig a little bit more into that. Okay? And I'm very skeptical of this divine masculine, divine feminine interplay, and I'm still working through that. Okay? And that's why I gave it that one a C minus. But with those caveats, if you combine everything that the chapter's about, especially this brilliant tension and balance, I've got to give him an A minus. I've got to give him an A minus. And I think we as Christians could do a much better job of helping people to treat themselves like someone they're responsible for helping. Recognizing that there are some people out there who fall into the trap of not seeing themselves being made in the image of God. And this is all the more true in our postmodern, post-enlightenment society. Okay? So, that's my summary on rule number 2. Rule number 1, he got a good score. Rule number 2, a good score. I know this one was a bit longer, but this was a longer chapter, and we dealt with a lot more ideas, especially controversial ideas. But I hope it was helpful for you guys. Okay? In the future, we'll go into rule number 3. Make friends with people who want the best for you. Interesting. Make friends with people who want the best for you. So that's going to be an interesting one to examine at that point. Thank you so much for watching that video all the way to the end. It really helps out this channel. I hope it provided some value to you. Other ways you can support what we do here is to click the subscribe button below or hit the notification button. If you want to support us financially, you can do so by finding our link to our Patreon in the description below. Every dollar goes towards helping grow this ministry and is greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for supporting us in any way that you can. Take care. God bless. Bye now.